Well, in today's installment, I want to share a little bit with you about Appalachian English, and I'll use a couple little stories to illustrate the points. Some folks allege that I have an Appalachian accent. Now, perhaps there may be some degree of truth to that accusation. I was raised around folks who spoke fluent Appalachian. However, I must confess that Appalachian English is not my first language, nor that of my nuclear family. Appalachian English is far more than an accent. It's a true dialect. Most people don't know the difference between an accent and a dialect. Accents are just one part of a dialect and mostly refer to how people pronounce words, and you can have an accent even if you speak otherwise standard English. A dialect, on the other hand, includes not only how you pronounce words, but also its unique grammar, vocabulary, and syntax or structure. Thus, a dialect has its own usage rules that are generally known but not usually written down like a standard language. Their use in speech is usually found among a particular people or in common among folks living in a specific geographic region such as Appalachia. The rules are generally consistent and well recognized both regionally and locally. Appalachian English has all these characteristics. Thus, in my opinion, Appalachian is a noble language in the fullest sense and worthy of our respect in its own right. I'd like to share a few stories that illustrate the richness of the Appalachian dialect. Along about 1980, I lived in Knoxville, and I liked to meet up with a few friends on Friday nights to pick a little mountain music and consume some of East Tennessee's finest liquor. Most Fridays we met in Knoxville, but on occasion we would gather at a friend's place up in Strawberry Plains, about 30 miles northeast of Knoxville. On one of these Friday nights, as I exited I-40 toward Straw Plains, I felt my old 66 VW Bug pulling hard to the right. As I was low on gas, I decided to stop and fill up and check my tires. I pulled into the Gulf Oil station right off the exit on Asheville Highway. It was in those days that the second gas crisis had pretty much put the last nail in the coffin of full-service gas stations. So I was a bit surprised to see an attendant headed for my car. Well, he was a big old boy, quite a bit taller than me. His little Gulf hat was perched on above his freckled face, highly sunburned face, on top of his round head. His red hair was burred off to no more than a peach fuzz. His blue Gulf Oil uniform shirt hung open over his rather ample stomach. I'd gotten out of my car to check the tires. As he walked up, I saw my right front tire was almost flat. He stopped and crossed his sunburned arms, exposing a belly button reminiscent of the Holland Tunnel. He asked, "Can I help you?" I responded, "Is your compressor working?" He slowly uncrossed his arms and squinted his eyes, cocked his head slightly, and then he took his forefinger and he pushed up on the brim of his cap and said, "What?" I repeated, "Is your compressor working?" He looked at me through slits of his eyes and cocked his head in the opposite direction and asked, "You mean R? We got R." I suppressed my smile and pointing to my tire said, "Yes, it's nearly flat." He repeated, "We got R," adding, "I'll put some R in your tars." As the tank was filling, he moved the air hose around the car, topping off each tire. He noticed the University of Tennessee decal on the back window of the Bug and asked, "Hugh at UT?" I said, "Yes." He allowed, "Hugh must be one of them there professors." I said, "No, just a student." And he kind of looked at me again and said, "Ain't you a bit old?" I laughed and said I was in graduate school. He squinted and cocked his head again and said, "Ain't got much schooling." I said, "Well, it looks like you're doing okay." He got a little sheepish grin and said, "It's a good job and I work as much as I want her." I smiled and nodded and said thanks, and we parted. This is another tidbit of Appalachian English from a couple of years later when I was working as a regional planner for TVA. We were holding weekly meetings to explore the need to relocate the ash pond at the Kingston Steam Plant. The plant superintendent, who was a local guy, missed one of the weekly meetings. The following week, when we asked him what happened, he responded, "We had us a fire down at the Pyre House." Vowel shifts from fire to far and power to pyre are examples of classic Appalachian form. Vowel shifts are common in Appalachia. Other examples being the pronunciation of wire, tired, and hired, so as to sound almost identical to the words war, tarred, and hard. A last example. One Friday evening, when I was living in Athens, Tennessee, a young man who worked for me asked if I'd take him to Knoxville to celebrate his 21st birthday. I still smoked in those days and was about out of cigarettes, so I stopped at the Kelly Mart on Highway 11 in the little town of Niota. It was raining and there were cats and dogs, and we ran into the store. We grabbed a couple of Cokes, and I asked the cute young girl behind the counter for a pack of Vantage Ultralights. About that time, a clap of thunder exploded directly over us and the lights flickered. I guess she had heard us talking about going to Knoxville because she glanced back at the pouring rain and said, "Now yin's make yourn's way careful to Knoxville here." I smiled and chuckled and told her that we would. I'd heard a fair amount of Appalachian in my time, but that was the first time that I learned that the plural yins had a plural possessive yearns. A few years later, I heard Professor Michael Montgomery, University of South Carolina, and editor of the Dictionary of Smoky Mountain English, interviewed on public radio. I decided to call him up, and we talked for about an hour, during which I shared these and some other examples I'd heard over the years. He thought they were great, and he told me he would include them in the new dictionary of Southern Appalachian English he was working on. Unfortunately, he passed away shortly after our conversation. His assistant finished up the work, but my contribution didn't make it. Regardless, I hope he has found this little dissertation on Appalachian English edifying. Thank you.